Hi, and thanks for listening to Loqpod. My name's Katy Ringsdore. Today I'm joined by Irwin Kula. He's an American rabbi and author, but he's also a disruptive spiritual innovator. Thank you so much for joining me today, Irwin. It's an absolute pleasure to have you on Loqpod. Perhaps it would be nice for you to start by introducing yourself and telling me a little bit about you.
Okay, first, it's delightful to be here too. I am a seventh generation rabbi who works on disrupting religion. And what that really means, I run a think tank at the intersection of innovation, religion, and the sciences of human flourishing. It's called CLAL, the Center for Learning and Leadership. And it's a very interesting moment to be working on what's happening with religion and where religion can go, and to apply innovation theory to a sector that we generally don't think about regarding religion, regarding innovation.
Absolutely. And, you know, it's such a fascinating topic. I mean, when I was researching you, or online stalking, as I like to call it, when I was doing a good deep dive into you, there are so many strings to your bow. I mean, I was struggling to even think about where to start this interview with you, if I'm honest with you, because you've got such a fascinating history and career so far. I mean, I think you were voted as one of the most influential rabbis a few years ago as well. I mean, you know, the things you've done over the years is quite astronomical. I mean, perhaps we should start by talking about, you know, what the key to successful disruption looks like to you, and certainly within the religious space.
Well, I think, you know, Craig Christensen was one of my teachers, blessed memory, and I think that disruption is the same in every single sector. Creating something new that's good enough to get the job done, and gets the job done for people in a more efficient way, in a simpler way, in a more accessible way. And that insight is true in every sector. We generally don't think about it in religion, but if there's real jobs to be done in religion, which there are, so I can get those jobs down to 3 or 4. One is, historically, the jobs of religion were to help build and foster community, to help create a sense of meaning and purpose, and to cultivate some moral virtue or character. So those are 3 really pretty important jobs for a society. You don't have community, you have a lot of loneliness. We have a despair of loneliness in growth across the West. I mean, it's very interesting. Great Britain even has a minister of loneliness. So we know that community is the problem. Moral imagination, nurturing the moral imagination, where is that going to get done? We can see the challenge of that in the incredible technological advances in mastering sort of the material world, which are so unbelievable what we're doing and what's coming down the pipe. But they have to be matched by some sort of mastery of our inner life and our moral imagination. And then we all want meaning in life, even if we can't discover the meaning of life. We want meaning in life, and we want purpose in life. And it used to be you went Sunday or Saturday to church or to temple, and you got some transcendent meaning, and work wasn't so important, and the week wasn't so important. But the Sabbath was holy, you realized who you were, and you had some meaning and purpose. Well, in the West, that's over for most people, and for most educated people, it surely is over. And for most psychologically aware people, it's really over. And the data is in on that in the West and Europe, and the data is in that increasingly in the United States. Okay, so where are we going to get those jobs done? I'm looking 2 places. One, faith-rooted leaders who are finished with trying to build congregations and get people to be more Jewish or more Protestant or more Catholic. Because the goal is not to get people to be more like you. The goal is to create spaces where people can be all of who they are. And so that's one area. And the other is the different sectors that these jobs are getting done. It seems to me, you know, if you look at the business sector these days, the business sector is being called upon to do things it never was called upon to do in creating meaning and purpose and justice. So that's it's actually disruption in any field, in any sector is exactly the same. Know what the job is to get done. Probably the incumbent business is not getting the job done well enough, or not getting the job done inaccessible, or it's too expensive, or too complicated, or barriers of entry are too high. And build new products and services. I know that's a weird word to use in religion, but build new products and services that actually get the job done.
I like that. And when you talk about products and services within religion specifically, what do you mean? I mean, is it about creating tools almost to generate a safe space for people to build community and understanding? What do you mean by that?
Right. So that's a perfect example. So historically, there are products and services of religion fall into a number of buckets. One, there are actual rituals. Those are practices, tools that help people accomplish something. So I don't care if it's a cross in a church or that you wear that connects you to some meaning and purpose in that tradition, or it's a something that you hang on your door in another tradition that invites you to think about what it means to welcome in, or a Sabbath practice that invites you to think about what is really my value, independent of whatever work or whatever I accomplish. These are practices, and these practices, every single religion has practices. Every single business has a lot of practices that help get some of those jobs done. Usually, it's community habit formation. That's character formation. Right? Then there's wisdom and the stories. So businesses have stories, but we call it brand stories in business. We don't call that in religion. But in religion, you have resurrection stories and salvation stories and promised land stories and hero stories. And we connect to those stories. Those stories have wisdom and they influence our lives and they help transmit values intergenerationally. And so we have all those wisdom stories. And then we have spaces that are also forms of their spaces are a form of product and service because you enter the spaces and the spaces themselves convey a certain, it's like if you go into an Apple store, that's really different than going into a bodega, and it makes you feel different without even talking to anybody yet. Well, that's the same thing. If you go into sacred spaces, those sacred spaces convey a kind of meaning and purpose and transcendence and way beyond the bricks and mortar of the space. So all of these are the products and services, the rituals, the practices, the norms, the spaces, the times that people gather, and the holidays that people celebrate, and the wisdom stories that people tell.
That's really interesting, and it's something that I haven't really considered before, is disruption within religion. And I really enjoy the way you've just described that. And there are lots of similarities within business, just like you said. Owen, I'd love to talk a little bit more about your career, actually, and how you got to this point of influencing disruption. How did you get to the top of your profession? Can you give me a bit of background into your career?
Yes, I grew up I have 5 younger brothers. I grew up in a clergyman's house. My father was a cantor. That's the person who sings in the Jewish synagogue. And I grew up in a home that the tradition was practiced in a very loving and beautiful way. And what that means is that we were always able to ask questions about what was the purpose of what we were doing. I wound up becoming a rabbi because if you're a seventh generation rabbi, that's sort of what happens. And then I had a lot of good influences sort of in my initial experiences in the rabbinate. And most important, I wound up coming to this think tank called CLAL, the Center for Learning and Leadership. It was designed early on. It was founded in '74, so we're going to have our 50th anniversary. And I've been there 35 years and have been the president for the last 20 years. It's designed specifically, initially, to think about the Jewish futures. In other words, how is Judaism as a religion going to fundamentally change because of the globalization, because of the change in technology, because the economic changes that the West was going through. And so it was a very forward-thinking place. And then I was very fortunate to be connected to Clay Christensen and the Innovator's Dilemma. A very close friend of mine gave me that book in 1997, 98. I read it open. This is like 100% what happened. I started reading it at like 11 o'clock at night, and I couldn't put it down. I'll be honest, I cannot say I understand every single part of the business part of that book, but I understood exactly who I was. Oh my gosh, I'm a disruptive spiritual innovator, and disruptive innovation needs to be applied to the sector of religion. And if it does get applied to the sector of religion, we will actually have a healthier society and more flourishing society. And I went to meet Clay at the Harvard Business Faculty, and interesting, Clay was the highest ranking Mormon in the Northeast sector of the church, and he'd never had a conversation about religion in the faculty room. We wound up having this incredible conversation. And I remember saying to him, I say this to you very respectfully, Professor Christensen, but it seems to me that Mormonism relative to Protestantism is itself a disruptive innovation. And he looked, because it doesn't have a laity, it doesn't have a clergy, it has a laity. It meets in house churches a lot. It really lowered a whole set of barriers of entry. It was more populist, etc. And he said, by golly, I never thought of that. And he sort of designated me and a friend of mine, a guy named Craig Hacktoff, the advanced team research on applying disruptive innovation to non-traditional domains like religion.
Wow.
And there's been a lot of other stories. I've had tremendous opportunities in my career to meet amazing people and to be connected. See, like even this, in all honesty, this conversation with you. So I meet you and we do this because somehow I get connected to Loqpod and that's by accident because someone else connects me and of course I look at Loqpod and I say, oh, what an interesting thing. It's just another disruption. I say that another disruption. Oh, financial exclusion is really a terrible thing. It's really bad in the world. And so look what happens. We can wait, I guess, for traditional legacy institutions like banks, etc., to fix this, or traditional legacy institutions, to fix the problem of exclusion. But it's inevitably, since money, by the way, like the currency of religion, is so central to being able to flourish, not surprisingly, someone emerges and disrupts the business so that you wind up being able to, end financial exclusion. That's a redemptive vision, right? That's a religion vision. Anything that says, I'm going to end a major problem that we've had forever, that's a very big vision. But you do it day to day, wandering towards the promised land of ending financial exclusion. So I get these connections to people, and then I get to see, oh my, look where this stuff is playing out. Remember, financial exclusion was taken care of by most local communities for most of human history, right? The local community made sure that people weren't excluded. The Dunbar rule was there weren't more than 150 people in most places in the world for most of human history. So most people couldn't be excluded the way they are excluded in abstract, bureaucratic, large systems as they are today, which is really a product of the industrial age and now kind of the modern, postmodern age. So if it's not being done by church and synagogue community plates and community alms like the charity gathering. Well, not surprisingly, right, in a business oriented, in a capitalist environment, not surprisingly, someone will emerge with an idea of, oh, let's use technology to actually do what we were always supposed to do, is not exclude people financially. That's how I look at stuff.
Yeah, and I love it. And, and I suppose we experience it as disruptors. I've worked for a couple of businesses now where we've disrupted the normal markets just to try and make things better for everyday life, exactly as you've just described it. Naturally, as part of that disruption, you've got to try and find the balance between conformity and disruption. But then on top of that as well, you experience backlash, naturally, because you're changing things. Have you experienced much of that in your career?
Yeah, I mean, backlash is a given. I don't care if it's backlash there's always backlash from the incumbent business. I don't care what the incumbent is. In religion, we call the backlash accusations of heresy. We have different language for it, okay? We have dilution. You're diluting the tradition. You're undermining the tradition. That's the language we use for the attacks incumbents have on anything new. But remember, that there is no such thing as a tradition without innovation, because all a tradition is an innovation that made it, right? So, and every innovator, I don't care who the innovator is, in what sector, hopes that their innovation will scale to some extent. And a scaled innovation in religious language is what a tradition is. So the same dynamics happen in every field. So of course I've had plenty of resistance. But the other thing that I learned, and this I also learned from the innovators, from the innovator's dilemma, is that it's very important not to get sucked into the fight with the resistance. The resistance is part of the drama, and maybe this comes from also a religious spiritual view, is that we need everybody, including the resistance. So I can learn from the resistance what I might be overlooking without being caught in the drama of having all my energy sucked out by the resistance. instead keep my eyes on the prize of building the alternative. And if you build the alternative, and the alternative is always with low-hanging fruit, says disruptive innovation, it is always with the people who are not presently being served by the existing institutions, the legacy institutions, the incumbent businesses. If you serve, and I mean serve here, no different than who Loqpod is serving. It is an underserved population that is financially excluded. Well, it's the same thing in religion. Many, many people are excluded, whether they're excluded because the dogma is too rigid. They're excluded because they've married across some boundary. They've excluded because their sexual orientation is different. They excluded because they no longer believe in the dogma and the creed. Right? They've been excluded. Well, that's the low-hanging fruit of people who still want purpose and meaning in their life, who still want to have their moral imagination cultivated, who still want feelings of awe and wonder and radical amazement, who still want to become more generous and compassionate and loving, and who still actually want a more just world. So the jobs are still there. The low-hanging fruit is as disruptive innovation says, the non-consumers of the existing products and services.
Yeah, and I couldn't agree with you more. And it's a really interesting view as well. I mean, how do you retain intellectual independence, Irwin? I mean, the reason I ask this is because, you know, you're a deep thought leader. You have some very strong views, and I really like the way your brain works personally on a personal level. I really do. I find you incredibly fascinating. So I'd just love to know how you're able to retain that intelligence from an independent perspective.
It's exactly the same, I'm sure, as any innovator that I've met in my sector. I'm very lucky. I have a bunch of people that I've developed relationships over the years who they are my VC people. Okay. Now we don't call it venture capital in the religion sector the same way. All right. Well, we call it as sort of impact philanthropy, or we call it, you know, we joke in with my people that I'm a highly speculative investment, you know, and the organization is a highly speculative investment because you're not going to see the impact of what I'm talking about, right, for the next 20, 25 years. Mm-hmm. Because until the next generation, until the real inflection point comes, we're about, at least the economists suggest that about 1/3 of all the religion sector in the United States will not be here in the next 36 to 48 months. So 1.2, $1.4 trillion sector. So about $400 billion will disappear. That's seminaries that go under. That's churches that merge or go under. And millennials and Generation Z, already more than 50% are not affiliated with institutional religion. I want to be clear. The non-affiliation with institutional religion, right, is not the problem. The challenge is the jobs that religion historically were supposed to get done now need to get done in other sectors. And so this leaves open tremendous possibility. But it's generational. We need new ideas. We need new R&D. We need people who think about this stuff to be taken out of the religion sector and put in other sectors. Right? And my sense is within the next 20 years, we're already seeing it in Fortune 500 companies, whole new roles that didn't exist 20 years ago. Chief Purpose Officer, right? Chief Meaning Officer, which right, PCW as a Chief Meaning Officer, Chief Play Officer, Chief Leisure Officer, Chief Community Officer, Chief Purpose Officer, Chief Integrity Officer, which is different than the compliance part of a company, which is illegal. This Chief Integrity is something different. Chief Wellness Officers. Well, these are all new. These jobs literally, and many of them are not in the HR department, not to criticize the HR department. They're in other parts which we know are more powerful in a lot of these institutions. And those are new roles. That's where it's like, now it's not yet, we wouldn't call those roles rabbis and ministers and pastors. We don't call it yet that. But the training for those roles is going to emerge to draw on wisdom traditions, going to draw on the variety of different faith communities unbundled. And that's a really important part. We're going to wind up on, just like in media, we've unbundled. My kids don't have cable TV. My kids stream, right? Mm-hmm. So, well, the same thing. We're going to wind up disintermediating and unbundling most of these Western religions. So you're going to take a practice or a wisdom story, right, from different traditions and use them as you need them to get real jobs done. You will not have to buy, I don't mean to be crass, but you will not have to buy the entire metaphysics. You won't have to buy the entire creed, the entire dogma. You'll be able to pick out a magnificent Jesus story, or a magnificent Buddha story, or a magnificent story about Muhammad and his wife, or you'll be able to borrow and taste or try a different food, or try a different religious practice, or a piece of a religious practice. And we're in the very, very beginning of unbundling. Look, it took a long time to get to Netflix. It wasn't like, poof, we had Netflix, and now look what's happening on Netflix. So we're going to, that unbundling, we need people to do that. The schools are not yet there. But another few, the seminaries are beginning to close. That will force new seminaries to arise that will be more cross-denominational, interdisciplinary, right? No different than the really great tech companies that hire artists and psychologists. They're not just hiring coders, right? They're not just hiring engineers, right? They're hiring people from different sectors so that we can create new kinds of collective intelligence. I think that's the most important thing, right? I think many of us know that we've reached the limits of our conceptual, philosophical, ethical sort of systems, our governance systems, our health systems. They're all collapsing, not because anyone's bad, but because they've reached their limits.
Yep.
And the next round of and it's going to be bumpy, it's going to be really turbulent. The next round will only get to some next iterations in all these systems if we produce new ways of being together that produce new collective intelligence. I mean, that's the hope of Web 3.0. Oh, that's the hope of the next iterations of technology too. But that's even Loqpod, because if you think about it, if you have less financial exclusion, you have more people contributing to the collective intelligence of the planet. So these things are all interconnected in a sort of wide-ranging meta crisis, so to speak, a crisis of how do we belong together, because we can no longer simply belong tribally. The crisis of the we. There is a crisis of meaning. There is a crisis of attention. What we give our attention to is what happens. So we have to learn how to control our attention, an old spiritual challenge. There's a crisis of the climate. There's a crisis of capitalism or inequality. And all these crises are interrelated and all require new forms of collective intelligence and collective psychological and moral development.
And when you talk about things like this, obviously you're constantly challenging yourself and the way you think. I mean, you couldn't be doing what you do today and just continue with one mindset. So I'd be really interested to know what you do for yourself to kind of develop your next stage of thinking, and who influences you, and what kind of gives you that drive to help develop your thinking on.
That's a great question. Well, first of all, for me, like, number one sort of, my animating sort of internal energy is curiosity. So start there. I think, that's probably a gift. I'm lucky. I was born with it. My mother was incredibly curious. I always tell the story that when we come home from school, my mother didn't care what we learned at all. She cared what questions we had. She would say, like, tell me a question about something that you learned today. She didn't care what we learned. She cared about the question. And, when that happens at 6 years old and 7 years old, 8 years old, and just, at that time, you just think your mother's kind of funny, right? But it turns out that I'm always, like, interested in the questions in people. Two, I really do love people, and I'm interested in people's stories. I'm interested in, and so I will go anywhere new. It's like even this. So I get connected to you, and so I spent like a couple of hours like, wow, what is Loqpod really? What is it really? Because I'm going to be, not that this is about that, but if I got to learn. Well, when you learn, the more you learn, the more patterns get made, and meaning is just about pattern making. And I like the pattern making. I like to see how, right? I like, wow, what is the analogy, the lockbox in my understanding of religion? If I create enough analogies, and what's the analogy of an Apple store to a church, and what's the analogy of all of these new titles in Fortune 500 companies with what's happening in religion? And what about we run a a program at Columbia Business School, our organization in collaboration with Columbia Business School, on spiritual entrepreneurship. It was the first program in America, and now two other universities are starting, two other business schools are starting it. Spiritual entrepreneurship. We took faith-rooted leaders who want to launch ventures using what they call the locked assets of their tradition. That is both their faith tradition, the social capital, the human capital, the financial capital. They're not interested in how many people come to their churches. They're interested in how they can unlock the assets of their churches to solve real problems in the world. Those problems can be literacy. The problems can be loneliness. The problems can be the pipeline between schools and prison. It could be hunger. It could be trafficking. And 200 ventures have been founded, 180 ventures have been founded in the last 6 years of people who, rather than getting up in the morning agonizing about the preservation of their institution, and I don't care what business you're in, if you get up in the morning and worry about the preservation of your institution's already dead. They worry about how their institution can serve in ever deeper and new ways real people to solve real problems. Now that shift has opened up doors, and so I'm meeting people all over, and then of course reading. I probably read 5-6 books a week.
Wow.
And again, do I read every single page? No, I don't read every single page, but I'll read the introduction, first chapter, and last chapter of it, 6 books a week, and in different spaces, right? So it could be a science book. It could be, obviously, over the last 5-7 years, it's been incredible amounts of business and technology books. Because business, today, this morning, I don't know if you know this, kid, this morning, the most important poll on trust in the world, it's called the Edelman Trust Barometer, came out this morning regarding trust in the society. And business came out the highest trusted institution and sector, right, in the country.
Right.
And by the way, that's not only the United States. I think that was also Europe. And it's remarkable. And second, not only trusted, right, at 64%. 64% of the people polled. And this is the largest study of trust that they come out like every 6 months. 64% of people polled trust business the highest of all sectors, more than doctors and more than lawyers and more, of course, than government and more than religious leaders and more than military leaders and more than journalists. Wow. That's the trust. And then the study went deeper. I can send this to you after so that you can see it. And then it went people's expectations of business domestically, expectations of business geopolitically, expectations of business in terms of purpose, in terms of justice. Now, I don't even know if that's good, because maybe this is asking too much of business. So I don't even know, but I think it's surely fascinating that at the same time that we're watching some real challenges to capitalism in a sort of late capitalism age, business is trusted the way it is. And so, like, if you're a religious or faith-rooted leader, or you care about how the society looks, if you're in the humanities at the university, or you need to take business really, really seriously. Almost like you needed to take religion seriously throughout the medieval period, because the Catholic Church was really pretty powerful in Europe. If you didn't have the Catholic Church on your side, right, you were in big trouble. And by the way, with that kind of power, obviously comes, as Spider-Man would say, immense responsibility.
And that goes right back to what you were saying earlier as well about new roles developing within business as well. And, there's a huge responsibility associated with that. Irwin, before I let you go, because I do know that you need to get on with the rest of your day, I do have one final question, and I would love to know about your experience of meeting the Dalai Lama, if you wouldn't mind.
Oh, yeah. I mean, again, one of the really blessed things that happened to me. So I wound up being invited to introduce the Dalai Lama in Feather Lakes, Colorado. There was a stupa, which is a Buddhist sacred temple that was dedicated, built in Feather Lakes and by the Shambhala lineage in America. And I had been involved in that lineage, and I was invited to introduce the Dalai Lama. So, I mean, it's a really, it's an intense thing to introduce to 5,000.
Yeah, no pressure.
Because in the end, a lot of pressure. In the end, I'm just a rabbi, and it is what it is, and I don't make more of it. But still, that was pretty intense. Well, the perk that you get was you got to go in I introduced and gave a little bit of a sort of talk on compassionate leadership, introduced the Dalai Lama. The Dalai Lama spoke. Then the Dalai Lama and his translator and me and two other people went into the stupa, and I got to spend some time with the Dalai Lama. So here's the story. So of course, because I'm an upper New York West Side Jewish liberal intellectual, I'm very insecure relative to standing with the Dalai Lama. So I'm gonna I'm gonna work on the best question ever, and I'm gonna really show that the Dalai Lama's gonna think I'm smart. That's my ego out of control. And we walk in there, and the way you do is you sort of lean over and he puts like a white scarf on you. It's called a kata. It's a way of saying I recognize your presence, you recognize my presence. So he bows, he leans down, and I put one over his. I lean down, he puts one over. I look into his eyes, and I'm about to ask my question, and I completely forget everything. I look at him, and I'm pretty psychologically aware. I'm a rational person. I do believe in sort of oneness, mystical experiences, but I'm not a touchy-feely guy. I forget everything. I go blank.
Wow.
And I mean blank. And I look into his eyes, and I swear now, Katie, I had this 1, 2, 3 experience in a billionth of a second. I look in, and I as if it was a spiritual MRI. I could feel all the ichiness inside of me. I could feel my flaws, not know them. I could feel them. I could feel the stains. I could feel, all the ichiness that's part of me. It was just like I could, and I felt this like, in a billionth of a second after that, I felt, oh, I'm perfect, exactly the way they am. And then the billionth of a second after that, you could do better, and it transformed my life. Ugh, perfect. You could do better.
Amazing.
And I realized, oh, that's how life is. We're all a It's hard to be human. It's hard to do this trip, this 80, 90-year trip if we're really lucky, and do it really, really well. It's really hard. If you do it 51-49, that's amazing. If you can produce a business that can serve people, if you can live a life that serves people, oh my God, that's amazing. But we're also perfect just the way we are. And we can always do better. And then I remembered my question. That's the weird thing. I said to the Dalai Lama, there's going to be a lot of loss. I don't talk to my people about loss because I'm on the opportunity side. But there's no possibility that there won't be loss. People's traditions are being lost. People's ways of having constructed their identity are being lost. It's really hard. People's jobs are being lost. It's really hard. And I speak about opportunity, but what do you do with people's loss? And of course, the Dalai Lama, having had to move from Tibet, having moved from India, etc., and China. So, he knows about that. He looks at me, goes to his translator. He has a very high voice. Go get me a bowl. He says, get me a bowl. And the translator comes back with a bowl. He turns to me and says, what's the most important part of this bowl? And I assumed that was rhetorical, so I didn't answer to. And he goes, the most important part of the bowl is the empty space. No empty space. No bowl. That's life. Loss, gain, loss, gain. And he does like an infinite loop with his hand, right? Loss, gain.
Wow.
Loss, gain. And those two teachings that happen inside of 3.5 minutes.
Goodness.
We're all a little iffy. We're all perfect. We could do better. And here's the dance of life. I don't care if you can call it Schumpeter's creative destruction. You can call it whatever you want. There's loss and gain, and loss and gain. And our job together is to wander around, choosing very carefully who we want to wander with, who will help us manage the loss and leverage the gain, manage the loss and leverage the gain.
And what a beautiful way of looking at life. If only we all had the strength to actually be able to carry that through. Imagine, how much richer our lives would be if we could, think about the gains when you're going through the terrible losses and, appreciate it when you're at that high point. I mean, that's just mind blowing.
And we need each other to do it. In other words, I really do believe the great companies of the future, right, will not only be the ones that serve people at high levels, right? And we're already seeing that. There's even the ESG and that kind of stuff, which is the beginning of recognizing there are better companies and worse companies. Companies have wider understandings. They call which shareholder to stakeholder. Those words don't matter to me. But companies that take into account more perspectives on what they do. I think we're going to see that. And amongst those things is companies that are able to have the sort of psycho-spiritual, and if you don't like spiritual, the psychological literacy to manage this dance better. And that's going to be very interesting next. It's always interesting to be human, but it's going to be very interesting next few decades as we manage incredible turbulence and incredible loss and unimaginable kinds of gains, literally unimaginable kinds of gains because of technology and because of communications, because of science, and because we're meeting people and getting to hear people's stories in ways that are unprecedented in human history. Never before could we hear so many people's stories. Now, the problem with that is it's triggering. It's hard. It's hard when you hear a lot of stories, and it's hard to discern the signal from the noise in the stranger's story. But then that was sort of the initial religious command in every religious tradition. Love the stranger. And I don't care. There's a lot of ways to love the stranger, right? You can love the stranger by saying, wow, somewhere in the world, someone is financially excluded. If you really love the stranger, and I don't know that person, and I'll never meet that person, right? But if one really loves the stranger, love isn't bullshitting around. If one really loves the stranger, one figures out how not to exclude. So it's going to happen in so many different spaces and places and sectors, and that makes it really exciting to wander together.
It certainly does. And I have to say, this has been one of my favourite Loqpod episodes ever. It's been truly magnificent speaking to you, Irwin. Thank you very much for your time today and for sharing some of your knowledge and thoughts with us.
Thank you so much, and I love listening to you too.